The bunker lights flickered for just a moment, barely noticeable, under the steady hum of the radar consoles. Iraqi officers hunched over their screens, eyes scanning for high-altitude signatures. The Americans were coming. That much was certain. The question was from where? But the screens remained empty. No blips, no alarms, nothing. Then the ground shook. A rumble rolled through the command bunker near Baghdad International. Dust fell from the ceiling tiles. Somewhere outside, fuel depots erupted into flame. Runways cracked apart in symmetrical, calculated strikes, and still on the radar, nothing. By the time the air defense network sounded its first alert, the targets were already destroyed. The Tomahawk cruise missiles had arrived, flying at treetop level, weaving through valleys and skimming under radar horizons. They'd sliced through the most heavily defended airspace in the Middle East like it didn't exist. No warning, no interception, no defense. Among those watching Soviet military advisors, embedded with Iraqi SAM crews, there was disbelief. These men had trained Iraq's Air Defense Corps. They had installed advanced versions of the S-75, S-125, and the mobile SA-6. They had boasted that the layered air defense grid, modeled on Soviet doctrine, would stand against anything NATO could throw at it. They were wrong, and they knew it within minutes. These weren't traditional airstrikes. These weren't bombers that could be vectored toward and engaged. These were autonomous weapons. Each one was a machine programmed to avoid detection, fly unpredictable routes, and deliver precision warheads with zero human input once launched. The horror didn't end with the first wave. In the first 48 hours of Operation Desert Storm, over 280 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched. Not one was shot down in the opening salvo. Not one was seen before it struck. Back in Moscow, the data arrived in broken transmissions and delayed satellite intercepts, but the pattern was unmistakable. The very SAM systems the Soviets had spent decades perfecting, the ones they had sold across the globe as impenetrable, had been bypassed like they weren't even there. This wasn't just an Iraqi failure. It was a Soviet humiliation. For years, the USSR had believed its air defense systems were the envy of the world. Now, they were watching their doctrine collapse in real time. Without a single dogfight, without a single radar lock. The enemy had changed the game, and the Soviet Union wasn't even on the board. Long before the first Tomahawk ever flew, the Soviet Union had already decided how war in the air would be fought, and it was a decision rooted not in possibility, but in certainty. Their integrated air defense system, IADS, the crown jewel of Soviet military engineering, was built on a simple assumption: everything that threatens us will fly like a plane. That meant altitude, that meant formation, that meant predictability. The IADS was layered with powerful radar-guided missiles like the S-75, SA-2, and S-200, each designed to target large, fast, high-flying aircraft, strategic bombers, reconnaissance planes, or NATO fighter bombers entering from Western Europe. The system didn't just work on firepower. It was designed around control-centralized detection, command decisions, coordinated locks. In theory, nothing could get through. But in that theory lay a fatal blind spot. Cruise missiles weren't new. Both NATO and the USSR had developed them. But for decades, they were treated as secondary tools, unreliable, difficult to guide, and easy to spoof. The Soviet assumption was that any effective attack would still rely on massed air power. That's where they put their money. They built radar installations optimized for altitude. They trained crews to expect signatures from jets and bombers. They taught operators to cue from radar intercepts, not terrain. They layered their missile networks upward, not downward. Because the enemy would come from above, cruise missiles broke every expectation. Instead of altitude, they used terrain masking, flying low, below ridge lines and city structures, ducking under the radar horizon. Instead of broadcasting signals, they used inertial navigation and GPS. Instead of a single flight path, each missile was pre-programmed with dozens of waypoints, allowing it to approach from an unexpected vector, even turning mid-course to strike from behind. But most dangerously, they were silent. Their radar cross-section was tiny, around 0.05, 0.1 square meters, smaller than a gull. To the Soviet radar net, they didn't look like aircraft. They looked like noise. So the data was filtered out, ignored, missed. And in the Soviet war rooms, thousands of miles from Baghdad, the implications didn't register. Not yet, because their models had one critical flaw. They were fighting an enemy they imagined, not the one that actually existed. By the late 1980s, Soviet air defense doctrine was a fortress of its own design, interlocking layers of radar-guided missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and early warning stations stretching across thousands of kilometers. On paper, it was flawless, redundant, impenetrable. At the top of the pyramid stood the S-200, designed to bring down strategic bombers at high altitude from over 200 miles away. Supporting systems like the SA-6 and SA-8 filled the gaps below. Together, they formed what Moscow considered an unbeatable shield. But shields are only effective if you understand what's being thrown at them. The Americans had built a spear no one saw coming. Air-land battle wasn't just about overwhelming force. It was about removing enemy coordination before the main assault ever began. That meant decapitating air defense, disabling radar, burning through communication hubs. And for that mission, the Americans didn't send planes. They sent cruise missiles, small, silent, and nearly invisible to radar. These weapons were never meant to be intercepted. They were meant to make interception impossible. The Soviet doctrine had no answer. The S-200 couldn't lock onto targets flying below 500 feet. The S-300, still in early deployment, was optimized for aircraft with clear signatures, not terrain-hugging missiles with the radar profile of a bird. Even mobile SAMs like the SA-6 struggled to track threats flying under tree lines and urban clutter. Worse, the system required human judgment at every stage. A radar operator needed to detect, a command post needed to confirm, a battery commander needed to authorize. But the Tomahawk didn't wait. Each missile had already calculated its flight path before launch. It knew where every radar station was. It flew under coverage, around detection arcs, through valleys and beside rivers, turning Soviet doctrine itself into an obstacle course it was designed to defeat. The assumption had always been that if you controlled the sky with enough firepower, no attacker could break through. But now, the sky no longer mattered. The Americans weren't flying over Soviet defense, they were flying under it. Doctrinally, it was a tectonic shift. The IADS wasn't being outgunned, it was being skipped. And inside Soviet headquarters, as data from Desert Storm began to trickle in, that realization began to burn. Every layer of their air defense was aligned upward. The real threat was beneath it all. It began at 2:38 a.m. Baghdad time, from the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. A coordinated swarm of over 280 Tomahawk cruise missiles leapt from U.S. Navy destroyers and submarines, flying in absolute silence toward one of the most densely defended airspaces on Earth. Baghdad slept. Radars watched, and not one detected them. They came in low 50 meters above the desert, in some cases hugging terrain, weaving between valleys and ridgelines, programmed to take unpredictable routes that no Soviet-designed defense system had ever anticipated. By the time the first explosions shattered Iraqi command bunkers, the war had already been won without a single plane in sight. In underground command centers, Iraqi officers scrambled to respond, but the radars were empty. The scopes were clean. There were no tracks to vector toward, no signatures to analyze. The incoming threats didn't fly like aircraft. They didn't jam. They didn't chatter. They didn't appear. They simply arrived at Baghdad's Al-Taji command post. A Soviet-trained SAM operator reportedly screamed into his headset, demanding confirmation of a radar ghost heading east. Seconds later, the screen went black. The console had been destroyed. Elsewhere, near Basra, 5 Tomahawks struck a communication relay site at precisely staggered intervals, disabling redundant backups before operators could react. No radar had ever seen them. No missile had been launched in defense in one sector. 12 missiles crossed a 100-mile stretch of defended territory. All 12 reached their targets. Not a single interception attempt was made. This wasn't a technological glitch. It was a doctrinal collapse. Inside Moscow, early intelligence reports were filtered through disbelief. Iraq must have deployed their assets improperly, said one general. The Americans have likely used some new jamming system, said another. The possibility that the system itself had failed was not yet admissible. But that night marked the first time in modern warfare when an entire nation's air defense network, designed, supplied, and supervised by Soviet engineers, was rendered irrelevant in minutes. It was the impossible event. A demonstration that a slow, subsonic, uncrewed missile could outmaneuver every radar, every SAM battery, every countermeasure the Soviet Union had spent decades perfecting. And it wasn't a one-time trick. It was the new baseline. In the hours following the first wave of cruise missile strikes, Moscow's war rooms lit up with chatter. Teletype reports from military attachés in Baghdad, intercepted U.S. communications, and scrambled statements from Soviet-trained Iraqi officers painted a picture too catastrophic to process. Hundreds of American missiles had bypassed the densest Soviet-designed air defenses in the world without being seen, tracked, or intercepted. But disbelief was immediate. At the General Staff Building in Moscow, senior air defense officials dismissed the reports, not because they lacked evidence, but because the implications were intolerable. This is disinformation, one colonel reportedly scoffed. A psychological operation. Another insisted our systems cannot have failed. The Iraqis must have deployed them incorrectly. And when satellite footage of burning command posts circulated, the conclusion came swift and sharp. The failure wasn't ours, it was theirs. To Soviet high command. The idea that their most advanced surface-to-air missile systems, built on 30 years of engineering, deployed in massive numbers, and exported as the centerpiece of Warsaw Pact defense, had been defeated by subsonic, unmanned weapons, was unthinkable. Because if it was true, it meant that the Soviet doctrine of layered, centralized, radar-reliant defense was no longer a shield. It was a blindfold. Still, a few inside the Ministry of Defense began to push back. Classified technical briefings, smuggled from Baghdad and confirmed by radio intercepts, showed unmistakable patterns. No missile launches recorded in response to Tomahawks. 0 radar tracks on known approach vectors. Simultaneous destruction of radar command nodes in multiple cities without prior warning. Yet even those data points were folded into a new narrative. The Americans must have used jamming. They must have launched decoys. They must have attacked while satellites were blind. Everything, anything, except the simplest truth, that the missiles had never needed to hide, because the Soviets had never learned to see them. It would take months well beyond Desert Storm's end for internal Soviet analysts to fully accept what had occurred, and even then, acceptance came not as transformation, but as dread. Because if their air defense systems could not defeat cruise missiles, then the entire concept of perimeter security, of strategic deterrence, of homeland protection was in question. They hadn't lost a battle. They had lost their assumptions. The Soviet response to the Gulf War's opening blow wasn't adaptation. It was retrenchment. Once the initial shock faded, engineers and planners at the GRAU and NIIR, the research arms of Soviet air defense, rushed to reassert control over the narrative. Their answer: bigger radar, better range, stronger power output. The assumption was clear. The Tomahawk's success must have come from slipping past their detection envelopes. Therefore, the solution was to widen the envelope. What followed was a flurry of accelerated development. High-frequency radars with broader sweep ranges, low-angle coverage extensions, pulse Doppler enhancements meant to track low-flying objects near ground clutter. A new generation of SAMs with extended tracking algorithms was proposed to plug the gaps. These technical upgrades were meant to recover lost ground. But the core problem wasn't range. It was belief. These new systems still operated on the old doctrine that an enemy had to reveal itself, fly within boundaries, behave in ways that could be anticipated and logged. Cruise missiles didn't do that. They weren't just stealthy. They were unpredictable. Their trajectories were not linear. Their altitudes fluctuated. Their signatures were so faint they blended into background noise, especially over forests, deserts, or coastal zones. And most critically, every Tomahawk could fly a different path. Some curved wide around known SAM zones. Others followed rivers or roads to mask radar reflection. Some even performed mid-course turns, so they would arrive from unexpected angles. Soviet radar crews weren't trained to handle this. Their computers weren't designed to track stochastic patterns. The cruise missile problem wasn't one of strength, it was one of pattern blindness. The upgraded radars failed to consistently acquire low RCS targets under 100 meters in altitude, especially in urban or mountainous terrain. Tests showed tracking lock times were too slow. Missile batteries required manual queuing. Automation lagged by seconds, and in a Tomahawk engagement, seconds were everything. But the biggest mistake wasn't technical. It was conceptual. Soviet engineers continued to model cruise missiles as if they were aircraft, just slower, lower ones. Engagement simulations showed kill probabilities based on fixed headings and smooth terrain. There was no modeling for erratic multi-vector attacks, saturation salvos, or synchronized decoy and real path pairing. They didn't simulate an attack by 100 missiles from 10 directions because they still didn't believe it would happen. The solution, in their minds, was always just more radar power, more signal strength, more control. They couldn't accept that the threat thrived in the gaps and that the more rigid and centralized their system became, the more vulnerable it was to something designed to slip through rigidity itself. If extended radar range couldn't catch the cruise missiles, perhaps electronic warfare could. That was the logic inside Soviet EW divisions as the failures in Iraq filtered back to Moscow. The next theory to dominate Soviet response jamming would neutralize the threat. If you couldn't shoot it, blind it, deceive it, spoof it into the ground, on paper, it made sense. Cruise missiles, particularly the Tomahawk, relied on GPS, terrain contour matching TERCOM, and digital scene matching DSMAC to stay on course. These systems weren't immune to interference. Soviet engineers believed that by deploying mobile ECM units, dedicated jammers and decoy transmitters, They could confuse the missile's navigation systems and throw them off course. New doctrines were drafted. Prototypes were deployed. Radar jammers were repositioned to create death bubbles over key targets, hoping to corrupt the incoming missile's guidance during final approach. In test ranges, some success was recorded against older cruise missile simulators, but in real-world scenarios, the theory fell apart fast. First, the Tomahawk wasn't flying with one guidance system. It used 3 to 4 simultaneously. GPS provided satellite-based accuracy. Tercom compared terrain data with preloaded maps. DSMAC used optical sensors to match real-time imagery with stored digital photographs of the target area. Spoofing one system meant nothing. Too difficult. All three impossible, without full-spectrum dominance over a wide area, something no Soviet EW system could achieve. Second, the assumption that jamming would confuse the missile only worked if the missile relied on external signals. Tomahawks didn't. Once launched, they were fire and forget. They didn't emit, they didn't ask for updates, they just flew. The Soviets were trying to blind a missile that wasn't even looking. Worse, American doctrine had anticipated this. Redundancies were layered into every missile. If GPS failed, it shifted to Tercom. If DSMAC lost visual lock, it recalibrated using inertial navigation. Jamming didn't create chaos. It created a trigger, a fallback to an equally deadly guidance mode. And in the event, a signal was lost entirely. The missile still hit within a 30-meter circle. Because the entire path was pre-programmed, Soviet jammers, built to mislead pilots, couldn't mislead algorithms. They were designed to scramble decisions, but cruise missiles didn't make decisions. They executed instructions with mechanical indifference and terrifying precision. So as Soviet ECM crews dialed up power levels and repositioned vans, the missiles kept coming silent, unreactive, and unstoppable. The second wrong theory collapsed the same way as the first. The Soviets were fighting ghosts, and ghosts cannot be jammed. Years before Desert Storm, the signs were already there, buried in white papers, NATO military journals, and intercepted U.S. procurement contracts. The Americans weren't hiding their cruise missile revolution. They were advertising it. And the Soviet intelligence apparatus, sprawling, obsessive, and deeply entrenched, missed it. Throughout the 1980s, U.S. naval doctrine underwent a quiet but seismic shift. Where once the emphasis had been on carrier strike groups and bomber escort formations, now a new model emerged: distributed lethality. The backbone of that model, the BGM-109 Tomahawk land attack missile, it wasn't developed in secret. It wasn't cloaked in disinformation. It was tested, refined, deployed, and written about in public. Pentagon briefings, defense expos, and military-industrial journals all reference the Tomahawk's evolving capability: long-range, autonomous flight, terrain-following navigation, and pinpoint accuracy against hardened targets. But inside the Soviet GRU and KGB, these reports were categorized as exaggeration, propaganda, designed to inflate U.S. deterrence. Analysts scoffed at the idea that a subsonic missile could evade layered defenses. They cited internal simulations showing high intercept rates. They argued that terrain-following flight was too unstable at scale. Worse, when American commanders began publishing articles in NATO strategic reviews openly discussing concepts like cruise missile saturation, radar bypass vectors, and first strike decapitation corridors, Soviet doctrine interpreters dismissed them as theoretical indulgences, paper exercises, intellectual bravado. The mindset was simple. If the Americans had such weapons, they wouldn't be talking about them. That assumption proved fatal. Even as the U.S. Navy forward-deployed vertical launch-capable cruisers and submarines, even as NATO began reorganizing its strike packages around long-range missile barrages, Soviet intelligence focused on the wrong metrics: aircraft inventory, tank movements, strategic bomber bases. They were preparing for a Cold War rerun. The U.S. was preparing for a software-driven blitz. Even the few voices inside Soviet intelligence who raised alarms were sidelined. One GRU analyst, in a suppressed 1989 internal memo, wrote, "If the Americans can program missiles to navigate terrain and attack independently, our radar coverage is no longer a shield. It is a map of vulnerability." His report never made it past the Third Review Committee. And so, in 1991, when the missiles finally came, not hypothetically, not on paper, but in fire and steel, Soviet planners watched the war unfold with no doctrine, no plan, and no counter, because the enemy hadn't just built a better weapon. They had built a system of war that Soviet intelligence had never truly believed was possible. The Tomahawk wasn't just a missile, it was a node in a larger ecosystem, a silent predator operating inside a battlefield where detection was death and disruption was victory. At its core, the Tomahawk BGM-109 was deceptively simple subsonic speed, 1,000-plus kilometer range, and a warhead under 500 kilograms. But simplicity was its disguise. Its lethality came from something far more dangerous than raw power integration. The American system didn't launch missiles. It synchronized attacks across air, sea, space, and data layers simultaneously. Each Tomahawk was preloaded with a custom flight path based on up-to-the-hour satellite imagery, terrain maps, radar zones, and weather data. These weren't guesses, they were calculations, generated by powerful, onboard mission planning systems, and fed directly into each missile's memory. The path wasn't straight. It twisted around radar stations, hugged terrain contours, weaved through valleys, and curved behind defensive arcs, where the Soviet Union imagined airstrikes as vectors. The U.S. Navy rendered them as threads, each missile, weaving a unique path toward the same objective from a different angle: altitude and timing. This made traditional air defense useless. Even if one Tomahawk were spotted, there was no guarantee a second or third would follow the same route. There was no corridor to protect, only chaos. The Tomahawk's guidance systems amplified this chaos. It used inertial navigation systems, INS, GPS, terrain contour matching, TERCOM, and even digital scene matching area, correlation, DSMAC. If one system failed, it defaulted to another. It didn't wait for signal, it didn't need a pilot, and it didn't hesitate. Launched from Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, Ticonderoga cruisers, and Los Angeles-class submarines, the Tomahawk struck without warning, often while the launching platform remained hundreds of kilometers outside detection range. But the missile itself was only one layer. Behind every launch was a reconnaissance web, satellites feeding real-time ISR data, airborne warning and control systems, AWACS scanning for gaps, and E3 Sentry platforms coordinating digital terrain updates. Even early GPS constellations, immature by modern standards, allowed for pinpoint precision far beyond what the Soviets considered possible. No human had to approve a missile's path once launched. No radar could force it to break lock because there was no lock to break. It wasn't flying toward resistance. It was flying around it. This was systems warfare in action. And perhaps most damningly, the American system was scalable. With just a few ships and submarines, hundreds of missiles could be deployed in hours. Strike planning wasn't centralized, it was modular. If one launch node failed, another picked up the slack. If one wave was compromised, the next altered course in silence. Soviet air defense planners had never imagined this. They had imagined waves of bombers, synchronized squadrons, radar-visible arcs. But the Tomahawk didn't fly in formation. It flew in multiples, autonomous, coordinated, and staggered for psychological as well as physical effect. And unlike aircraft, once the missile was fired, it didn't retreat, it didn't jam, it didn't evade, it didn't respond. It just continued forward. In the language of war, the Tomahawk didn't just break Soviet defenses, it erased them. In January 1991, as the Tomahawks screamed over desert sands and through the hearts of hardened bunkers, a single theater of operations would expose the Soviet air defense myth in the most brutal terms imaginable. Baghdad, a city defended by over 3,000 surface-to-air missiles, dozens of fixed and mobile radar systems, anti-aircraft guns on rooftops, in stadiums, along highways, all arranged in layers just as Soviet doctrine prescribed. It was supposed to be a fortress. Instead, it became a proving ground for obsolescence. One of the most devastating examples came with the strike on the H-3 airfield complex, a critical node in Iraq's Western Air Corridor. Soviet advisors had helped establish its defenses years earlier. It was surrounded by SA-2s, SA-3s, and mobile SA-6 units. High-power acquisition radars covered every approach vector. Operators were on alert. And yet, when the strike came, nothing moved. Dozens of Tomahawks approached from different angles, diving in low across the Syrian border, using valleys and elevation drops to stay masked. One by one, they struck fuel depots, radar dishes, aircraft hangars. Not a single interceptor launched. Soviet engineers watching via secure line reported complete system confusion. One radar station operator had multiple false positives, but each time he ordered a launch, there was no lock. Others had no detection at all. The missiles had flown beneath their scan arcs, hitting from directions they weren't programmed to monitor. The same scenario unfolded in Baghdad's downtown command nodes. Key control centers were struck with surgical precision. No mass airstrike, no wave of jets, just small explosions. Perfectly timed and impossibly accurate. The Iraqis believed it was sabotage, but the real culprit was far more terrifying. A dozen missiles that flew inside their airspace for nearly 20 minutes unseen. The humiliation wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. Radar operators refused to report clean screens in the hours following, fearing court-martial. Officers faked missile launches in logs to avoid implication. Engineers blamed power fluctuations, but the data told a darker truth. The most advanced Soviet-designed air defense in the Middle East had recorded 0 intercepts. What's more, the Americans had held back. Many targets had been deliberately spared to send a message. This is what we can do. Next time, we erase everything. In Moscow, analysts tried to reframe the event. Perhaps the Iraqis didn't follow protocol. Perhaps the Americans had used secret technology. But these explanations collapsed under scrutiny. Independent satellite footage and field reports confirmed what Soviet generals didn't want to believe. Their systems had performed exactly as designed. They had just been designed for the wrong war. The Tomahawks had entered Baghdad under their radar, struck with impunity, and exited without detection. It wasn't just a defeat. It was an exposure. The Soviet military had weathered disappointments before. From early setbacks in Afghanistan to intelligence gaps in the Vietnam War, there had always been a way to reinterpret failure as context-specific, temporary, or the fault of lesser allies. But the Tomahawk shattered that illusion. This wasn't a regional failure or a tactical mishap. It was the collapse of an entire military philosophy, the foundational belief that overwhelming detection and denial capabilities, arranged in rigid layers of centralized control, could guarantee strategic sanctuary. The realization spread like radiation across Soviet planning circles. Not just the radars were obsolete, the logic was. A system that required perfect visibility had just been outmaneuvered by a weapon designed to avoid being seen. A network that relied on command hierarchy had just been outpaced by weapons that required no commands. A strategy that assumed speed, mass, and altitude where advantages had just been undone by something slow, small, and quiet. This wasn't just military failure. It was ideological defeat, because in Soviet thinking, doctrine wasn't merely practice, it was identity. The air defense system wasn't just hardware. It was a symbol of state control, a national guarantee of invulnerability, a living expression of Marxist planning theory applied to warfare, centralized power, unified coordination, maximum redundancy. And the Americans had beaten it with software, with algorithms, with decentralization, with prediction instead of reaction, with modularity instead of hierarchy. In the Kremlin, strategic reviews turned grim. Planners tasked with assessing NATO threat profiles found themselves erasing entire sections of previous doctrine. S-300 deployments were quietly accelerated. Hypotheses about autonomous strike platforms gained sudden urgency. But time had already run out. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself was unraveling. Economic stagnation, internal dissent, and structural failure had done what no cruise missile could break the state from within. And yet, as documents were declassified years later, Western analysts discovered something chilling. As late as 1989, Soviet air defense doctrine still projected a 90% intercept rate against all air-breathing threats. That statistic, rooted in Cold War confidence, had survived reality. Reality hadn't just moved on, it had flown past unseen, unstoppable, undeniable. In the end, it wasn't that the Soviets didn't know what cruise missiles could do, it's that they couldn't afford to believe it. Because to believe it meant acknowledging that the West had built a future they no longer knew how to fight. Today, the missile defense landscape is cluttered with buzzwords. Hypersonics, AI targeting, swarming drones. Nations compete not only in arms, but in algorithms. And yet, beneath all the modern veneer, a Cold War specter remains. The Tomahawk was never about flash. It didn't roar like a jet or streak across the sky like a missile on parade. It whispered. It slipped through gaps. It made itself small, not to hide, but to fit into the places doctrine forgot. And in doing so, it became more than a weapon. It became a reality check. For every modern system still built around big signatures, centralized control, and vertical command hierarchies, the ghost of the Tomahawk haunts the schematics. It asks, have you accounted for quiet, for decentralized attack, for the weapon that doesn't ask permission and doesn't give you a second chance? In Ukraine, Syria, and other battlefields, echoes of this ghost continue to shape outcomes. Russian air defenses, evolved and upgraded, still struggle with stealthy, low-profile threats. Cruise missiles, Western and now indigenous, continue to make mockeries of hardened sights. And every time a radar fails to blink before the explosion comes, somewhere in a command post, a Cold War echo returns Baghdad. 1991, a clean screen, a crater where the radar should be. The lesson was never just about missiles. It was about belief and how hard it is to kill one. Because long after the Soviet Union fell, Its assumptions live on in bunkers, in planning rooms, in strategy briefings. But so does the ghost. The ghost that proved one missile, seen too late,